The woman in navy dress blues stood perfectly still as they removed her insignia one by one. Lieutenant Commander Elena Torres watched in silence as her naval aviator wings were torn from her chest, the golden metal catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the court-martial chamber. The gallery was packed with officers who had once called her a friend, now watching her public disgrace with a mixture of fascination and horror. What none of them knew was that the Pentagon had been trying to locate Commander Torres for the past 6 months, and the highest levels of naval intelligence were about to discover she was sitting in a Norfolk courtroom, stripped of rank and facing 20 years in military prison. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other at Naval Station Norfolk. Captain Marcus Reid adjusted his service dress blue uniform in the mirror of his quarters, running his fingers over the ribbons that told the story of his 20-year career. 3 deployment ribbons, 2 commendation medals, and a Purple Heart from his time in Iraq. Not bad for a Navy JAG officer who had never seen real combat, he told himself. The reflection staring back showed a man in his early 40s with graying temples and the kind of confidence that came from never losing a case. Reid had built his reputation on being thorough, relentless, and absolutely merciless in the courtroom. He didn't just win cases. He destroyed careers, dismantled reputations, and left his opponents in smoking ruins. The other JAG officers at Norfolk called him the executioner behind his back, a nickname he secretly cherished. Today was going to be another notch in his belt, another stepping stone toward his goal of making Admiral before he turned 50. The case file sat open on his desk, thick with documentation that painted a clear picture of guilt. Lieutenant Commander Elena Torres, 32 years old, former FA-18 Super Hornet pilot with the VFA 106 Gladiators. The charges were serious enough to end any career: violation of direct orders, unauthorized access to classified materials, conduct unbecoming an officer, and the big one that would seal her fate, suspected espionage. Reid had seen the evidence, and it was damning. Torres had been caught accessing files she had no business seeing, downloading classified flight data, and worst of all, she had been in contact with foreign nationals through encrypted channels. The woman was finished, and Reid was going to be the one to finish her. He had reviewed her service record multiple times, looking for any angle of attack. Torres had been a decent pilot, nothing spectacular, with a service record that was clean but unremarkable. She had flown missions over Syria and Iraq, routine combat air patrols mostly, but nothing that would indicate she was anything more than a competent aviator doing her job. Her fitness reports were solid, but not exceptional. Her peer evaluations showed she was well-liked but not considered leadership material, and her psychological evaluations revealed someone who was perhaps too independent for the Navy's liking. Perfect prey for someone like Reid. He thrived on taking down officers who thought they were special, who believed their service record gave them some kind of immunity from the consequences of their actions. Torres was about to learn that no one was above the law, especially not some mid-level pilot who had gotten too big for her britches. The courtroom began filling an hour before the proceedings were scheduled to begin. Word had spread throughout Norfolk that this was going to be a significant case, and officers from across the base had come to watch the spectacle. Reid recognized faces from the air wing, from base operations, from the command staff. Even some civilian contractors had somehow gotten word and managed to secure seats in the gallery. This was exactly the kind of audience Reid loved. The more people who witnessed his victories, the better. Lieutenant Commander Torres entered the courtroom, flanked by 2 master-at-arms, her wrists shackled with standard military restraints. She moved with the measured pace of someone who had learned to carry herself with dignity, even in the worst circumstances. Her dress blue uniform was immaculate, every ribbon in perfect alignment, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. But Reid noticed something that made him smile with satisfaction. Her uniform was notably sparse compared to other officers of her rank and experience. A few routine ribbons, a standard deployment medal, nothing that would indicate distinguished service or exceptional performance. She looked exactly like what Reid expected, a mediocre officer who had finally overreached and gotten caught. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her posture straight despite the restraints. But Reid could see the signs of stress around her eyes. Good. The pressure was getting to her. That would make his job easier. Torres took her seat at the defendant's table next to her appointed counsel, Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Chun, a young JAG officer who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. Chun was competent enough, but he was no match for Reid's experience and reputation. Reid had specifically requested to prosecute this case when it came across his desk, knowing it would be a career-making victory. Taking down a suspected spy would look very good when his promotion board convened next year. The gallery continued to fill as the minutes ticked by. Reid recognized Commander Patricia Walsh from the Air Wing, a stern woman who had never liked Torres and made no secret of it. Walsh had been one of the first to point fingers when suspicions about Torres began to surface, claiming she had always known there was something off about the younger officer. Several of Torres' former squadron mates were present, their faces carefully neutral, but their presence clearly not in support of their former colleague. Most satisfying to Reid was the presence of Captain Jennifer Morrison, the base commanding officer who had personally signed off on the charges against Torres. Morrison was a political animal who understood the importance of being seen on the right side of a high-profile case like this. She sat in the front row of the gallery, her expression cold and disapproving as she stared at the woman she had once trusted with million-dollar aircraft and classified missions. As the appointed hour approached, Reid made his final preparations. He arranged his notes with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments, each document placed exactly where he would need it during his opening statement. The case was ironclad, the evidence overwhelming, and Torres was going to be made an example of. Reid had spent weeks preparing his strategy, anticipating every possible defense Chin might attempt, ready to counter every argument with devastating precision. The bailiff called the court to attention as the military judge entered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Sarah Hamilton was known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for theatrics, which suited Reid perfectly. He preferred judges who focused on facts and evidence rather than emotion and sob stories. Hamilton had a reputation for being fair but firm, and Reid knew she would see through any attempt by the defense to paint Torres as some kind of victim. Reid rose for his opening statement, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the start of a major prosecution. This was his element, his domain, and he was about to demonstrate why he was considered one of the most effective prosecutors in the Navy JAG Corps. The gallery fell silent. Dozens of pairs of eyes focused on him as he approached the jury box, where 5 senior officers sat ready to determine Torres' fate. "Members of the jury," Reid began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "over the next few days, you will hear evidence of betrayal that strikes at the very heart of our military security. The defendant, Lieutenant Commander Elena Torres, swore an oath to protect and defend the United States of America. Instead, she chose to violate that oath in the most fundamental way possible." Reid paused, letting his words sink in as he made eye contact with each member of the jury. These were senior officers, men and women, who understood the gravity of military oaths and the consequences of breaking them. They would not be sympathetic to someone who had betrayed their trust and endangered their brothers and sisters in arms. The evidence will show that Lieutenant Commander Torres deliberately and systematically accessed classified materials that were far above her clearance level. She downloaded sensitive flight data, operational parameters, and intelligence briefings that she had no legitimate need to see. When confronted about these activities, she lied to her superior officers. When given direct orders to cease her unauthorized activities, she continued them in secret. Reid moved closer to the jury, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that forced them to lean forward and pay closer attention. This was a technique he had perfected over years of courtroom combat, drawing his audience in before delivering the killing blow. But most damning of all, the evidence will show that Lieutenant Commander Torres was in regular contact with foreign nationals through encrypted communications channels. She shared classified information with individuals whose identities and motivations remain unknown to this day. In short, members of the jury, Lieutenant Commander Torres is nothing more than a common spy who used her position and her uniform to betray everything we hold sacred. The reaction in the gallery was immediate and visceral. Reid could hear the sharp intake of breath, the whispered conversations, the rustling of uniforms as officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Commander Walsh nodded approvingly, her suspicions confirmed by Reid's authoritative presentation of the case. Captain Morrison's expression grew even colder, if such a thing were possible. As she stared at Torres with undisguised contempt, Reid continued his opening statement for another 20 minutes, methodically laying out the prosecution's case piece by piece. He detailed the timeline of Torres' alleged crimes, the sophisticated methods she had used to access classified systems, and the pattern of deception that had allowed her to undetected for months. By the time he returned to his table, Reid was confident that he had already won the case in the minds of the jury. Torres remained motionless throughout the entire presentation, her expression giving nothing away. She didn't flinch when Reid described her as a traitor, didn't react when he detailed the potential damage her actions might have caused to national security. Either she was an exceptionally good actress, Reid thought, or she was in complete denial about the gravity of her situation. Either way, it wouldn't matter once he started presenting evidence. Lieutenant Junior Grade Chun's opening statement was everything Reid had expected it to be: weak, desperate, and fundamentally unconvincing. The young lawyer gamely tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that Torres was merely a dedicated officer who had been trying to better understand operational requirements. He hinted at classified aspects of Torres' service that couldn't be discussed in open court, a standard defense tactic that Reid was fully prepared to demolish. "My client is not the spy that Captain Reid would have you believe," Chun argued, his voice lacking the conviction that Reid had projected effortlessly. "Lieutenant Commander Torres is a patriot who has served her country with distinction. The evidence will show that her actions, while perhaps technically irregular, were motivated by a desire to better serve her mission and protect her fellow service members." Reid almost laughed out loud at the weakness of Chun's position. Technical irregularities? Torres had committed federal crimes, violated her oath of office, and potentially compromised national security. No amount of legal sophistry was going to change those facts. The young lawyer was clearly out of his depth, probably chosen for this case because no one with experience wanted to be associated with such an obvious loser. As Chun continued his rambling defense of his client, Reid began planning his methodical destruction of their case. He would start with the computer forensics, showing exactly how Torres had accessed systems she had no right to use. Then he would present the communication logs, proving her contact with foreign nationals. Finally, he would bring in expert witnesses who would testify about the potential damage her actions could have caused to ongoing operations. It would be a masterful prosecution, the kind that would be studied in JAG schools for years to come. Reid imagined future prosecutors analyzing his techniques, learning from his systematic approach to building an unshakable case. This was more than just a court-martial. It was going to be a career-defining moment that would establish Reid as one of the premier military prosecutors of his generation. The first witness Reid called was Chief Petty Officer David Kim, a cybersecurity specialist who had been part of the investigation team that uncovered Torres' alleged crimes. Kim was a solid witness, thorough in his preparation and clear in his testimony. He walked the jury through the technical aspects of how Torres had accessed classified systems, using language that was detailed enough to be convincing, but simple enough for non-technical officers to understand. Lieutenant Commander Torres used her authorized access to the base network as a jumping-off point, Kim explained, gesturing toward a computer screen that displayed system logs and access records. From there, she employed sophisticated techniques to escalate her privileges and gain entry to classified databases that were well above her security clearance level. Reid felt a surge of satisfaction as Kim detailed Torres' activities day by day, hour by hour. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Torres had accessed files related to operational planning, intelligence assessments, and tactical procedures that she had no legitimate need to see. Even more damaging, she had downloaded this information to external storage devices, clearly intending to remove it from secure facilities. "In your professional opinion, Chief Kim," Reid asked during his direct examination, "was Lieutenant Commander Torres' access to these systems authorized?" "Absolutely not, sir," Kim replied without hesitation. "Her security clearance gave her access to routine flight operations data, nothing more. What she was accessing required clearances that were significantly higher than anything in her personnel file." Reid could see the jury members taking notes, their expressions growing more serious as Kim's testimony continued. These were experienced military officers who understood the importance of security protocols and the consequences of violating them. They were seeing Torres not as a fellow officer who had made a mistake, but as someone who had deliberately and repeatedly violated the trust placed in her. The cross-examination by Lieutenant Chen was as ineffective as Reid had anticipated. The young lawyer tried to suggest that Torres might have been authorized to access the systems through some kind of special assignment or temporary clearance upgrade, but Kim shot down every attempt with calm professionalism. "Sir, I've been doing cybersecurity for the Navy for 12 years, Kim explained patiently. "Any temporary clearance upgrade or special access authorization would have left electronic footprints in our systems. I found no evidence of any such authorization for Lieutenant Commander Torres." Reid's second witness was even more damaging. Commander Lisa Park from Naval Criminal Investigative Service had led the investigation into Torres' activities and had personally conducted the interrogation when Torres was first arrested. Park was a seasoned investigator with an impressive track record of breaking complex cases involving military personnel. Lieutenant Commander Torres initially denied accessing any classified systems beyond her authorized level. Park testified, referring to her notes from the interrogation. When confronted with the electronic evidence of her activities, she became evasive and refused to answer further questions without an attorney present. Reid nodded approvingly. Invoking the right to counsel wasn't necessarily an indication of guilt, but combined with the lies Torres had initially told, it painted a picture of someone who knew she had been caught and was trying to cover her tracks. "Did Lieutenant Commander Torres offer any explanation for her activities during your investigation?" Reid asked. "She claimed she was researching operational parameters to better understand her mission requirements," Park replied. "However, the files she accessed had no relation to her current assignment or any assignment she had held in the previous 2 years. Many of the documents dealt with operations in theaters where she had never served." Reid could feel the case building momentum like an avalanche. Each witness, each piece of evidence, each devastating revelation was adding weight to the prosecution's argument that Torres was guilty of the most serious charges facing any military officer. The jury was clearly convinced, and even Torres' own attorney seemed to be going through the motions rather than mounting any serious defense. The third day of testimony brought Reid's most important witness, Captain Robert Chun, the intelligence officer who had discovered the pattern of unauthorized access that led to Torres' investigation. Chun was a man who took security seriously, and his testimony would demonstrate the potential damage Torres' actions could have caused to ongoing operations. The files Lieutenant Commander Torres accessed contained detailed information about operational procedures, asset locations, and intelligence assessments, Chun explained to the jury. This information, in the wrong hands, could have compromised ongoing missions and potentially endangered the lives of American service members. Reid felt a surge of triumph as Chun detailed the scope of Torres' access to sensitive information. The intelligence officer painted a picture of systematic espionage, describing how Torres had methodically worked her way through classified databases over a period of several months. This wasn't a case of someone accidentally stumbling into information they shouldn't see. This was deliberate, planned, and potentially catastrophic to national security. In your professional assessment, Captain Chun, Reid asked during his direct examination, what would be the motivation for someone to access this particular combination of files? Chun's answer was devastating. The only logical explanation would be intelligence gathering for a foreign power. The files Lieutenant Commander Torres accessed would provide a comprehensive picture of our operational capabilities and limitations in multiple theaters. This information would be extremely valuable to any adversary seeking to understand and counter American military operations. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations as the implications of Chun's testimony sank in. Reid could see several officers staring at Torres with expressions of disgust and betrayal. This was no longer just about a military officer breaking rules. This was about someone who had potentially sold out her country and endangered the lives of her fellow service members. Reid's final witness of the week was Dr. Patricia Reeves, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Torres after her arrest. Reid had requested the evaluation hoping to establish that Torres was mentally competent and fully aware of her actions, eliminating any possibility of an insanity defense or claims of diminished capacity. Lieutenant Commander Torres demonstrated no signs of mental illness or psychological impairment, Dr. Reeves testified. Her responses during our sessions were coherent, logical, and demonstrated clear awareness of the consequences of her actions. In my professional opinion, she was fully capable of understanding the nature and implications of her behavior. Reid felt the satisfaction of a job well done as Dr. Reeves concluded her testimony. Every aspect of the prosecution's case had been methodically presented and convincingly argued. Torres was guilty, the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury would have no choice but to convict on all charges. This was exactly the kind of high-profile victory that would accelerate Reid's career and establish his reputation as one of the Navy's premier prosecutors. As the court adjourned for the weekend, Reid began planning his closing argument. He would review every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, every damaging revelation that had emerged during the trial. Torres would be convicted, sentenced to decades in prison, and serve as a warning to any other military officer who might be tempted to betray their oath. The gallery slowly emptied as officers filed out, their conversations focused on the shocking revelations that had emerged during the trial. Commander Walsh made a point of approaching Reid after the session, congratulating him on what she called a masterful prosecution of a traitor. Captain Morrison nodded approvingly as she passed, clearly satisfied that justice was being served and that the Navy's reputation would be protected. Torres was led away by the master-at-arms, her expression still giving nothing away despite the devastating testimony that had been presented against her. Reid watched her go, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came with destroying an opponent who had dared to challenge the system. She would spend the weekend in her cell, contemplating the ruins of her career and the decades of imprisonment that awaited her. But as Reid packed up his files and prepared to leave the courtroom, He had no idea that events were already in motion that would transform his moment of triumph into the most humiliating defeat of his career. In Washington, D.C., phones were ringing in offices that existed on no public organizational chart. People with security clearances that required special authorization, just to mention, were asking questions about a Navy JAG officer named Elena Torres, who had apparently disappeared into the military justice system. The weekend would bring revelations that would shake Norfolk Naval Station to its foundations and expose Reid as something he had spent his entire career trying to avoid being seen as: a fool who had dramatically overplayed his hand against an opponent he never should have challenged. But for now, Reid basked in the glow of what he believed was his greatest victory, unaware that he had just prosecuted the most highly classified officer in the United States military. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized everything at Norfolk Naval Station. Captain Marcus Reid stepped out of his government-issued sedan feeling invincible, his leather briefcase containing what he was certain would be the final nails in Elena Torres' coffin. The weekend had been productive, spent refining his closing argument and preparing for what would surely be a swift conviction. He had even taken time to draft a press release announcing the successful prosecution, knowing that high-profile espionage cases attracted media attention that could benefit his career. The base seemed different somehow as Reid walked toward the courthouse. More activity than usual, with personnel he didn't recognize moving purposefully between buildings. Several black SUVs with government plates were parked in areas typically reserved for base command staff. Reid dismissed these observations as routine military business, too focused on his impending victory to consider that something significant might be developing. Inside the courthouse, Reid noticed an unusual number of people gathering in the hallway outside the courtroom. Not just the typical spectators who had attended the previous sessions, but individuals in expensive suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes stood near the entrance, speaking quietly into a secure phone. Reid had never seen her before, but something about her presence made him inexplicably nervous. Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Chun looked haggard as he arrived at the courthouse, carrying a thick manila envelope that hadn't been in his possession the previous Friday. The young defense attorney's entire demeanor had changed over the weekend. Where before he had seemed defeated and going through the motions, now there was an energy about him that Reid found unsettling. Chun's eyes held a knowledge that hadn't been there before, as if someone had finally explained to him what this case was really about. Reid pushed aside his growing unease and focused on the task at hand. Today he would present his final witnesses, deliver his closing argument, and watch as the jury convicted Torres on all charges. Nothing that had happened over the weekend could change the overwhelming evidence he had presented. Torres was guilty, and no amount of last-minute legal maneuvering was going to alter that fundamental fact. The courtroom filled quickly as the morning session began. Reid noticed several new faces in the gallery, men and women who wore their civilian clothes like uniforms and watched the proceedings with the intense focus of professionals conducting surveillance. The silver-haired woman from the hallway had taken a seat in the front row, her position commanding a clear view of both the defense table and the prosecution. When she looked at Reid, he felt a chill that he couldn't explain. Captain Sarah Hamilton called the court to order, but something in her manner suggested she was operating under unusual pressure. The military judge had always been a picture of composed authority, but today there was tension in her voice, and her movements seemed more controlled than usual. She glanced frequently toward the gallery, as if expecting some kind of interruption. That would change the entire nature of the proceedings. Reid called his final witness, Commander Patricia Walsh from the Air Wing, who was eager to testify about Torres' supposed character defects and suspicious behavior. Walsh had been vocal about her suspicions regarding Torres even before the formal investigation began, And Reid was counting on her testimony to paint a picture of someone who had never truly belonged in the Navy's tight-knit aviation community. Lieutenant Commander Torres always seemed distant from her squadron mates. Walsh testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades evaluating junior officers. She didn't participate in the usual social activities, rarely spoke about her background or family, and seemed to have knowledge about operational matters that exceeded what someone of her rank and position should possess. Reid felt satisfied as Walsh continued her character assassination, describing Torres as secretive, antisocial, and potentially dangerous. This was exactly the kind of testimony that would resonate with a military jury, painting Torres as someone who had never truly embraced the brotherhood and sisterhood that defined military service. Did you ever observe, Lieutenant Commander, Torres accessing computer systems or handling classified materials in a manner that concerned you? Reid asked during his direct examination. Absolutely, Walsh replied without hesitation. She frequently stayed late in the squadron spaces, supposedly reviewing flight data and operational procedures. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, but in retrospect, it's clear she was using that access to gather intelligence for unauthorized purposes. Reid was building toward his crescendo when Lieutenant Chun stood to begin his cross-examination. Of Walsh, the young lawyer's approach was completely different from his previous passive questioning. He moved with confidence, carried himself with authority, and spoke with a precision that suggested he finally understood something crucial about his client. Commander Walsh, Chun began, his voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the gallery lean forward. How long have you held your current security clearance? Walsh looked momentarily confused by the question. I have a secret clearance which I've maintained for my entire career. Why is that relevant? Chun moved closer to the witness stand, holding a document that Reid couldn't quite see. And, in your opinion, what level of clearance would someone need to access the operational files that Lieutenant Commander Torres allegedly downloaded illegally? Top secret at minimum, Walsh replied confidently. Possibly top secret, with special compartmented information access. Those files contained extremely sensitive operational data. Chun nodded thoughtfully, as if Walsh had just confirmed something important. Commander Walsh, I'm going to show you a document that was declassified for the purposes of this trial as of 0800 hours this morning. Reid shot to his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to introduce evidence that wasn't disclosed during discovery. Captain Hamilton looked toward the gallery, specifically at the silver-haired woman who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Overruled, Captain Reid. The witness may examine the document. Chun handed Walsh a single sheet of paper with multiple official seals and classification markings. Reid watched in growing alarm as Walsh's confident expression transformed into confusion, then shock, then something approaching terror. The color drained from her face as she read whatever was written on that page. Commander Walsh, Chun continued with deadly calm. According to this document, what security clearance does Lieutenant Commander Torres actually possess? Walsh's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. This says, she has top secret clearance with special access program authorization, multiple compartmented information accesses, code word clearances that I've never even heard of. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations as the implications of Walsh's words began to sink in. Reid felt his carefully constructed case beginning to crumble around him. How was this possible? Torres' personnel file clearly showed only a basic secret clearance. There had been no indication of any special access or higher-level authorization. Chun wasn't finished. Commander Walsh, according to that document, when was Lieutenant Commander Torres granted these clearances? Walsh struggled to read the dates through her obvious distress. It shows initial top-secret clearance granted 6 years ago. Special Access Program authorization granted 4 years ago. Most recent compartmented information access, granted 18 months ago. Reid's mind was reeling. 6 years ago would have been early in Torres' career, long before she had the rank or position that would typically warrant such high-level clearances. 4 years ago, she had been just another junior officer flying routine missions. 18 months ago, she had been assigned to what everyone believed was a standard aviation billet at Norfolk. "One final question, Commander Walsh," Chun said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards. "Based on the clearance levels shown in this document, would Lieutenant Commander Torres have been authorized to access every single file that forms the basis of the prosecution's case against her?" Walsh's answer was devastating to Reid's entire prosecution. Yes, according to this, she would have been authorized to access all of those files and many others that are far more sensitive. Reid objected frantically, demanding to examine the document, calling for a recess, anything to stop the complete destruction of his case. But Captain Hamilton was already taking control of the situation in a way that suggested she had been prepared for exactly this development. "Captain Reid," Hamilton said with the kind of calm that preceded a judicial earthquake, "approach the bench immediately." Reid stumbled forward, his confidence evaporating with each step. Chun joined him at the sidebar, carrying additional documents that Reid was certain would destroy whatever remained of his prosecution. The silver-haired woman in the gallery was watching intently, her secure phone held ready as if she were prepared to make calls that would reach the highest levels of government. "Captain Reid," Hamilton said quietly, "I've just been informed that this case involves classified aspects that were not disclosed to the prosecution. Lieutenant Chun has presented credentials and documentation that require this court to immediately suspend proceedings pending a security review." Reid tried to process what he was hearing, but the words seemed to bounce off his consciousness without making sense. Classified aspects? Security review? How was any of this possible when he had been given complete access to Torres' personnel file and service record? Chun leaned in closer, his voice barely audible even at the sidebar. "Captain Reid, my client's actual service record is classified at levels that require special authorization even to acknowledge. What you've been prosecuting as espionage was actually a decorated intelligence officer performing her assigned duties." The words hit Reid like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about Elena Torres, every assumption he had made about her background and capabilities, every piece of evidence he had presented to the jury was based on incomplete and deliberately misleading information. He had been prosecuting someone whose real service record made his own career look like a training exercise. Hamilton continued the sidebar conference with the kind of measured precision that suggested she was following protocols that had been established long before this trial began. "Captain Reid, you are hereby ordered to cease all prosecution activities pending a complete security review of this case. The jury will be dismissed, and all evidence will be secured by appropriate authorities." Reid wanted to object, to fight, to salvage something from the wreckage of what had been his most important case. But the look in Hamilton's eyes told him that this was far beyond his authority or understanding. Forces were at work that he had never even imagined, and he was nothing more than a bit player who had stumbled into a drama that operated at levels he couldn't comprehend. As Reid returned to his table, he noticed that the gallery had filled with even more people he didn't recognize. Federal agents, intelligence personnel, and individuals whose credentials he could only guess at were taking positions throughout the courtroom. The silver-haired woman was speaking rapidly into her secure phone, coordinating what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated response to a situation that had been anticipated and planned for. Captain Hamilton addressed the jury with the kind of careful language that legal professionals used when they needed to explain something without actually explaining anything. "Members of the jury, this court has been notified that new information has come to light that requires the immediate suspension of these proceedings. You are hereby dismissed from this case and instructed that all matters discussed during this trial are subject to military security protocols. Reid watched in stunned silence as his carefully selected jury filed out of the courtroom, their faces showing confusion and concern about the abrupt end to what had seemed like a straightforward case. Several of them glanced back at Torres, clearly wondering what they had missed about the defendant who had sat silently through days of testimony that now appeared to be fundamentally flawed. Lieutenant Chun was packing his documents with the efficiency of someone who had expected this outcome. Gone was the nervous young lawyer who had seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case against his client. In his place was a legal professional who clearly understood aspects of military law and national security that Reid was only beginning to comprehend. Torres herself remained motionless at the defense table, her expression unchanged despite the dramatic reversal of her legal situation. She had sat through days of testimony that painted her as a traitor and spy without showing any emotion, and now she was displaying the same composed silence as her alleged crimes were revealed to be something entirely different. Reid found himself wondering what other secrets were hidden behind that carefully controlled exterior. The silver-haired woman approached the defense table and spoke quietly to Torres, showing credentials that made Chun step back respectfully. Reid couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Torres nodding and responding with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she recognized the woman's authority. This wasn't a stranger delivering unexpected news. This was someone Torres had been expecting. As the courtroom continued to empty, Reid found himself alone with the devastating realization that his career-defining victory had become the most humiliating defeat of his professional life. Everything he thought he knew about Elena Torres had been wrong. Every assumption he had made about the evidence had been flawed. Every confident assertion he had made to the jury had been based on incomplete information that painted a completely false picture of the defendant. The implications were staggering. If Torres possessed the security clearances that had been revealed during Chun's cross-examination, then she hadn't been stealing classified information. She had been authorized to access it. If her real service record was classified at levels that required special authorization to acknowledge, then her apparent mediocrity was nothing more than a carefully constructed cover identity. If federal agents and intelligence personnel were responding to her case with this level of coordination and preparation, then Elena Torres was far more important than anyone at Norfolk Naval Station had ever imagined. Reid tried to piece together how such a massive misunderstanding could have occurred. Torres' official personnel file showed a standard career progression for a naval aviator with unremarkable performance and routine assignments. Her security clearance was listed as secret, appropriate for someone of her rank and position. Her psychological evaluations indicated someone who was competent but not exceptional, dedicated but not remarkable. But now Reid was learning that everything in that official file was essentially meaningless, a collection of false information designed to conceal Torres' real role and responsibilities. Her actual clearances were so high that they required special authorization even to acknowledge. Her real service record was so classified that it couldn't be discussed in an open courtroom. Her true importance was so significant that her prosecution had triggered responses from levels of government that Reid had never even considered. The silver-haired woman finished her conversation with Torres and approached Reid with the kind of professional courtesy that carried an unmistakable undercurrent of authority. She extended her hand and introduced herself with a name and title that Reid immediately recognized as carrying far more weight than his own position. "Captain Reid," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I'm Deputy Director Catherine Stevens from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I think we need to have a conversation about Lieutenant Commander Torres and the rather significant misunderstanding that has developed regarding her service record." Reid shook her hand with fingers that he hoped weren't visibly trembling. The Defense Intelligence Agency was so far above his security clearance level that he had never expected to encounter anyone from that organization, much less have them personally involved in one of his cases. The fact that a deputy director had responded personally to Torres' prosecution suggested that he had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple espionage case. Stevens gestured toward a door at the rear of the courtroom that Reid had never noticed before. There are some things about Lieutenant Commander Torres' actual service that you need to understand, Captain Reid. Things that will help explain why your prosecution was based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about who you were actually charging with these crimes. As Reid followed Stevens toward the door, he caught a final glimpse of Elena Torres being escorted from the courtroom by personnel who clearly weren't standard military police. These were professionals who moved with the kind of practiced coordination that suggested they were accustomed to handling individuals whose importance far exceeded their apparent rank or position. The door led to a secure conference room that Reid was certain hadn't existed the previous Friday. The walls were lined with equipment that he recognized as designed to prevent electronic surveillance, and the table was already set with documents that carried classification markings he had never seen before. Stevens took a seat across from Reid and opened a folder that contained information that would completely reshape his understanding of the woman he had spent weeks trying to destroy. Captain Reid. Stevens began with the kind of measured tone that suggested she was about to deliver information that would fundamentally alter his perception of reality. Lieutenant Commander Elena Torres is one of the most highly classified intelligence assets in the United States military. Her apparent service record is what we call a cover legend, designed to conceal her real assignments and capabilities from anyone without appropriate security clearances. Reid felt his remaining confidence crumble completely as Stevens continued her explanation. Torres wasn't just an authorized user of the classified systems he had accused her of illegally accessing. She was one of the few people in the military with authorization to access information that was far more sensitive than anything in his prosecution. Her contacts with foreign nationals weren't evidence of espionage. They were part of intelligence operations that served American interests in ways that Reid couldn't even begin to understand. Stevens opened the folder and began revealing aspects of Torres' real service that made Reid's 20-year career look like basic training. Multiple deployments to locations that didn't appear on any official maps. Operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted enemy intelligence networks, and saved American lives in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Commendations and decorations that were so highly classified that they couldn't be displayed on any uniform or mentioned in any official record. The woman you've been prosecuting as a mediocre pilot who turned traitor, Stevens explained with devastating calm, is actually one of the most effective intelligence operatives we've ever deployed. Her work has directly contributed to national security successes that will remain classified for decades. The reason she was accessing those files wasn't to steal information for foreign powers. It was to analyze intelligence that was directly related to ongoing operations that she was personally managing. Reid realized that his entire prosecution had been not just wrong, but catastrophically, career-endingly wrong. He had publicly accused one of America's most valuable intelligence assets of being a traitor. He had presented evidence to a jury that painted a decorated operative as an enemy of the state. He had built his case on the assumption that Elena Torres was exactly what her cover legend suggested she was, never imagining that everything he thought he knew about her was deliberately false. The implications for his career were devastating. But Reid was beginning to understand that his personal humiliation was the least significant consequence of this massive misunderstanding. If Torres' real work was as important as Stevens was suggesting, then his prosecution might have compromised ongoing operations, exposed classified methods, and potentially endangered intelligence assets whose existence was known to only a handful. of people in the entire government. Stevens closed the folder and fixed Reid with a stare that made him feel like a child who had broken something irreplaceable. Captain Reid, your prosecution of Lieutenant Commander Torres has created a situation that requires immediate damage control at the highest levels of government. The fact that her cover was blown during a public court-martial means that we need to completely restructure operations that have been years in development. Reid wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had only been working with the information he had been given, but he realized that any excuse would only make him sound more foolish. He was a senior JAG officer with decades of experience. He should have recognized that something wasn't right about this case. The pieces had been there for anyone who knew how to look for them, but Reid had been too focused on his own ambitions to see the larger picture. As Stevens continued explaining the scope of Reid's mistake, he began to understand that his career wasn't just over. It had been obliterated in a way that would serve as a cautionary tale for future generations of military prosecutors. He had prosecuted one of America's most important intelligence assets based on a cover story that he had taken at face value, and the consequences of that error would reverberate through the defense establishment for years to come. The secure conference room door opened again, and Reid turned to see Elena, Torres entering with the composed bearing of someone who was finally able to drop a performance that had lasted for years. Gone was the silent defendant who had sat passively through days of humiliating testimony. In her place was a professional whose presence commanded immediate respect and whose capabilities were clearly far beyond anything Reid had ever imagined. Torres took a seat at the table and fixed Reid with a gaze that contained no anger, no resentment, just the kind of professional assessment that intelligence operatives used when evaluating potential threats or assets. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an authority that made Reid realize he had never really seen the real Elena Torres until this moment. "Captain Reid," she said with measured calm, "I think it's time you learned who you've actually been prosecuting." Captain Marcus Reid sat in stunned silence as Elena Torres began speaking, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the secure conference room. The woman who had endured days of public humiliation without uttering a single word in her own defense was now revealing depths of knowledge and experience that made Reid's accomplished career seem insignificant by comparison. "My real name is Elena Maria Torres Vega," she began, her tone measured and professional. "For the past 8 years, I've been operating under deep cover as part of a joint defense intelligence agency and Central Intelligence Agency program that places highly trained operatives in conventional military units. My cover identity as a mediocre naval aviator has allowed me to conduct intelligence operations in 17 different countries while maintaining the appearance of a routine military career." Reid felt his world continuing to collapse as Torres methodically destroyed every assumption he had made about her background and capabilities. The woman he had dismissed as a second-rate pilot with delusions of grandeur was revealing herself to be exactly the kind of elite operative that he had always secretly wished he could become. Deputy Director Stevens opened another folder and spread photographs across the table that showed Torres in various operational environments. In one image, she was dressed as a civilian contractor meeting with individuals whose faces had been deliberately obscured. In another, she was in full combat gear, leading what appeared to be a special operations team through hostile terrain. A third photograph showed her in formal diplomatic attire at what looked like a high-level international conference. Lieutenant Commander Torres has successfully penetrated enemy intelligence networks, recruited foreign assets, and prevented terrorist attacks that would have resulted in significant American casualties, Stevens explained as she pointed to each photograph. Her work in Syria alone prevented 3 separate chemical weapons attacks that could have killed thousands of civilians and drawn the United States into direct military confrontation with multiple nation-states. Torres continued her explanation with the kind of clinical precision that Reid associated with the most elite intelligence briefings. The files you accused me of stealing were actually part of my assigned mission parameters. I was conducting a comprehensive security assessment of Navy intelligence systems to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign intelligence services. The foreign nationals you claimed I was sharing information with were actually assets that I had personally recruited and was managing as part of ongoing operations. Reid tried to process the magnitude of his error, but the scope of his misunderstanding seemed to grow with every word Torres spoke. He had built his entire case on the assumption that she was a criminal, when in reality she was one of the most effective operatives in the American intelligence community. Every piece of evidence he had presented to the jury as proof of her guilt was actually documentation of her success in missions that served American interests in ways he had never imagined. Stevens pulled out a thick document with classification markings that Reid had never seen before. "Captain Reid, what I'm about to show you is Lieutenant Commander Torres' actual service record. This document requires special presidential authorization to access, and you are being granted temporary clearance to view it solely to help you understand the scope of your prosecutorial error." The real service record was nothing like the fabricated file that Reid had used to build his case. Torres had graduated first in her class from the Naval Academy before being recruited into the intelligence program while still a midshipman. Her flight training had been a cover for advanced instruction in intelligence tradecraft, foreign languages, advanced weapon systems, and psychological operations. What appeared to be routine deployments with her squadron had actually been carefully orchestrated assignments that placed her in positions to conduct sophisticated intelligence operations. "The woman you described to the jury as antisocial and secretive," Stevens continued, "was actually maintaining operational security protocols that are essential for deep cover operatives. Her apparent lack of close relationships with squadron mates wasn't evidence of suspicious behavior. It was professional discipline that kept her cover intact and protected her fellow service members from potential compromise." Torres leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Reid's face as she continued her explanation. "Every aspect of my apparent military career has been carefully designed to support intelligence operations that you lack the clearance to fully understand. My mediocre fitness reports were deliberately written to ensure I wouldn't attract attention or be considered for high-profile assignments that might expose my real mission. My seemingly routine flight operations provided cover for intelligence gathering activities in denied areas where conventional collection methods would have been impossible." Reid realized that Torres wasn't just revealing her true identity. She was providing him with an education in the sophisticated methods that the intelligence community used to protect their most valuable assets. The cover legend that had fooled him so completely had been crafted by professionals who understood exactly how to create a believable false identity that would withstand scrutiny from anyone without appropriate security clearances. Stevens opened yet another folder, this one containing commendations and awards that Torres had earned during her intelligence career. A Distinguished Service Medal for preventing a terrorist attack in Eastern Europe. A Defense Superior Service Medal for recruiting a foreign intelligence officer who provided information that prevented a major cyber attack on American infrastructure. Multiple intelligence community awards that recognized operations so sensitive that even their general nature couldn't be discussed in most classified environments. The decorations in Lieutenant Commander Torres' real service record, Stevens explained, represent achievements that have directly contributed to American national security in ways that will remain classified for decades. The operations she has conducted have prevented wars, saved thousands of lives, and protected American interests around the world. Her work has been personally briefed to 3 different presidents and has influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government. Reid found himself staring at evidence of professional accomplishments that dwarfed anything he had achieved in his own career. While he had been prosecuting routine military justice cases and building his reputation in the comfortable environment of Norfolk Naval Station, Torres had been conducting operations in hostile territories where discovery would have meant torture and death. Torres continued her methodical destruction of Reid's assumptions with the kind of patient professionalism that Reid now recognized as characteristic of someone who had spent years maintaining false identities under extreme pressure. The psychological evaluation that your expert witness claimed showed I was competent and aware of my actions was actually accurate. Captain Reid, I was fully aware of what I was doing when I accessed those classified systems, because accessing them was exactly what I was supposed to be doing according to my mission parameters. The implications of Torres' revelation extended far beyond Reid's personal humiliation. If her cover had been blown during a public court-martial, then years of carefully constructed operational security had been compromised. Intelligence networks that had taken years to develop might need to be abandoned. Foreign assets who had risked their lives to provide information to American intelligence might now be in mortal danger. Stevens seemed to read Reid's thoughts as she explained the broader consequences of his prosecution. Captain Reid, your case against Lieutenant Commander Torres has created a national security crisis that extends far beyond this courtroom. Her cover identity has been compromised in a public forum, which means we need to extract assets, abandon ongoing operations, and restructure intelligence networks that have been years in development. Reid felt the full weight of his error settling on his shoulders like a crushing burden. He had spent his career believing that he served American interests by prosecuting military personnel who violated their oaths and betrayed their country. Now he was learning that his most high-profile prosecution had actually endangered one of America's most valuable intelligence assets and potentially compromised operations that protected American lives. Torres opened her own folder and began displaying photographs that showed the real consequences of intelligence work. Images of terrorist training camps that had been disrupted based on information she had provided. Diplomatic negotiations that had succeeded because of intelligence she had gathered. Military operations that had been successful because of enemy capabilities she had identified and reported. Every mission I've conducted has been designed to protect American service members and advance American interests, Torres explained with quiet intensity. The intelligence I've gathered has prevented attacks on American military bases, identified threats to American diplomatic personnel, and provided warning of enemy capabilities that could have surprised and killed American forces. Reid realized that Torres wasn't just defending herself. She was providing him with a comprehensive education in the realities of modern intelligence work. The comfortable world of military justice that Reid inhabited was supported by professionals like Torres who operated in environments where the stakes were measured in lives lost and national interests compromised. Stevens pulled out a secure tablet and began displaying real-time intelligence reports that showed the immediate consequences of Torres' blown cover. Assets were being evacuated from hostile territories. Operations were being terminated. Intelligence networks that had provided critical information were being dismantled to protect the people who had risked everything to help American intelligence. This is what your prosecution has cost us, Captain Reid, Stevens said as she scrolled through report after report of compromised operations and endangered personnel. Years of work, millions of dollars in investment, and most importantly, human intelligence sources who may now pay with their lives for their cooperation with American intelligence. Reid watched in horror as the scope of his mistake became clear. The case he had thought would define his career had actually damaged American national security in ways that would take years to repair. Intelligence operations that had protected American lives were being abandoned. Foreign assets who had trusted American intelligence with their lives were now at risk of discovery and execution. Torres continued her explanation with the kind of comprehensive detail that Reid now recognized as characteristic of someone who had been trained to brief senior government officials on complex intelligence matters. "The foreign nationals you claimed. I was sharing classified information with included a Russian intelligence officer who was providing information about planned cyber attacks on American infrastructure, a Chinese military official who was warning U.S. about aggressive actions in the South China Sea, and an Iranian nuclear scientist who was providing details about his country's weapons program." Each revelation hit Reid like a physical blow. The evidence he had used to prove Torres was a traitor was actually documentation of her success in recruiting and managing foreign intelligence sources who were providing invaluable information to American decision-makers. The communications he had characterized as espionage were actually professional intelligence exchanges that served American interests. Stephen stood and walked to a secure communication device that allowed her to contact intelligence officials around the world. Reid could hear fragments of conversations about emergency extraction procedures, compromised assets, and terminated operations. Each exchange represented years of careful work that was being destroyed because of his prosecutorial error. "Lieutenant Commander Torres," Stephen said as she returned to the table, "we need to discuss your reassignment options. Your cover identity has been completely blown, which means you can no longer operate in environments where you might be recognized. We'll need to develop a new legend and establish you in a different operational capacity." Torres nodded with the kind of professional acceptance that Reid recognized as characteristic of someone who had always understood that intelligence work involved constant adaptation to changing circumstances. She had spent years building a false identity that allowed her to serve American interests, and now she would need to start over because of Reid's mistake. Reid found his voice for the first time since Torres had begun her explanation. "Lieutenant Commander Torres, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. I built my prosecution on assumptions that were not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. I accused you of being a traitor when you were actually serving your country in ways that I never even imagined were possible." Torres looked at Reid with an expression that contained no anger or resentment, just the kind of professional assessment that intelligence operatives used when evaluating whether someone could be trusted with sensitive information. "Captain Reid, you were working with the information you were given. The failure wasn't yours alone. It was a systemic failure that allowed a deep cover operative to be processed through the conventional military justice system without appropriate security reviews." Stevens returned to her seat and opened another folder that contained documents Reid recognized as related to his own career and security clearance. The implication was clear. His involvement in this case would require a comprehensive review of his background and qualifications to ensure he could be trusted with the classified information he had been exposed to. "Captain Reid," Stevens said with the kind of measured tone that suggested she was about to deliver information that would further complicate his situation, "your prosecution of Lieutenant Commander Torres has demonstrated gaps in our security procedures that need to be addressed. We need to understand how a deep cover operative could be charged with espionage without triggering the security protocols that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of misunderstanding." Reid realized that his career wasn't just over. He was about to become the subject of his own investigation as intelligence officials tried to understand how such a massive security failure could have occurred. His prosecutorial skills, which he had always considered his greatest professional asset, would now be turned against him as investigators examined every aspect of his handling of the Torres case. Torres began packing her documents with the efficiency of someone who was accustomed to rapidly changing operational environments. Her transformation from silent defendant to authoritative intelligence professional was complete, and Reid could see that she was already thinking about her next assignment and the challenges of rebuilding an operational identity that had taken years to establish. "The damage assessment will take weeks to complete," Stevens explained as she gathered her own materials. "We need to identify every asset who might have been compromised, every operation that might need to be terminated, and every intelligence product that might need to be reevaluated based on Lieutenant Commander Torres' blown cover." Reid watched as the two intelligence professionals prepared to leave, taking with them the comfortable certainty that had defined his understanding of military justice and national security. The world they inhabited was far more complex and dangerous than anything he had encountered in his conventional military career, and his brief exposure to their reality had left him feeling inadequate and unprepared. Torres paused at the door and turned back to face Reid one final time. "Captain Reid, the military justice system serves an important function in maintaining discipline and good order. But intelligence work operates in environments where conventional rules don't always apply. The next time you encounter a case that seems too straightforward, consider the possibility that there might be aspects of the situation that you don't have the clearance to understand." As Torres and Stevens left the secure conference room, Reid found himself alone with the devastating realization that his most successful prosecution had been his most catastrophic failure. The woman he had tried to destroy had revealed herself to be everything he had always pretended to be, a true servant of American interests, who had risked everything to protect her country and her fellow service members. The secure room seemed to close in around Reid as he contemplated the ruins of his career and the broader implications of his mistake. Outside, Norfolk Naval Station continued its routine operations, but Reid knew that his world had been fundamentally altered in ways that would take him years to fully understand. His phone buzzed with a message from his commanding officer requesting an immediate meeting to discuss recent developments in the Torres case. Reid realized that word of the security review was already spreading through the chain of command, and soon everyone at Norfolk would know that the prosecutor who had built his reputation on never losing a case had just suffered the most humiliating defeat in military justice history. But as Reid prepared to face the consequences of his actions, he also began to understand something about service and sacrifice that his comfortable career had never taught him. Elena Torres had endured days of public humiliation, professional destruction, and personal attack without revealing information that could have immediately vindicated her, but would have compromised ongoing operations and endangered American lives. The real lesson of the Torres case wasn't about prosecutorial technique or legal strategy. It was about the difference between serving your own interests and serving something larger than yourself. Reid had spent his career building his reputation and advancing his ambitions, while Torres had spent hers risking everything to protect people she would never meet and serve causes she could never publicly acknowledge. As Reid finally left the secure conference room and walked back into the normal world of Norfolk Naval Station, he carried with him the knowledge that he had been given a glimpse into a level of service and sacrifice that few people ever witnessed. The woman he had tried to destroy had shown him what true dedication to country really meant, and the lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't the victory Reid had planned. Instead of emerging as a successful prosecutor who had brought a traitor to justice, he was leaving as a chastened officer who had learned the hard way that the world of intelligence and national security was far more complex and dangerous than anything his conventional military experience had prepared him to understand. The real Elena Torres was walking away from the wreckage of years of careful work, ready to rebuild her operational identity and continue serving American interests in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Reid was walking toward a reckoning with his own limitations and a future that would be forever shaped by his encounter with someone who represented the very best of what military service could be. 3 weeks later, Captain Marcus Reid stood in the same courtroom where his career had been destroyed, but this time he was the one facing judgment. The gallery was nearly empty except for a few administrative personnel and the silver-haired woman he now knew as Deputy Director Catherine Stevens. The military judge presiding over his administrative review was Rear Admiral James Mitchell, a man whose quiet authority filled the room despite speaking in measured, careful tones. Reid had spent 21 days in administrative limbo while investigators examined every aspect of his handling of the Torres case. His security clearance had been suspended pending review. His access to classified materials had been revoked. His office had been searched by federal agents who confiscated files, computers, and personal items that might contain information related to the compromised intelligence operation. The investigation had been thorough and devastating. Reid learned that multiple safeguards had been in place to prevent exactly the kind of prosecutorial error he had made, but he had either ignored or failed to recognize the warning signs that should have alerted him to Torres' true status. The fabricated personnel file should have raised questions when certain classification markings didn't match standard formats. The unusual restrictions on Torres' background investigation should have prompted additional security reviews. The fact that her defense attorney had been provided with special security clearances should have indicated that classified aspects were involved in the case. Admiral Mitchell opened the sealed folder that contained the findings of the investigation, his expression revealing nothing about the conclusions that would determine Reid's future. Captain Reid, the investigation into your prosecution of Lieutenant Commander Torres has identified multiple procedural failures and serious lapses in judgment that resulted in the compromise of ongoing intelligence operations and the endangerment of American assets worldwide. Reid felt his stomach tighten as Admiral Mitchell began reading from the report. Every mistake he had made, every warning sign he had missed, every assumption that had proven catastrophically wrong was documented in clinical detail. The investigation had painted a picture of a prosecutor so focused on his own career advancement that he had ignored security protocols designed to protect the nation's most sensitive operations. The investigation found that you failed to conduct appropriate security reviews when inconsistencies in the defendant's personnel file were brought to your attention by junior staff members, Admiral Mitchell continued. You dismissed concerns raised by base security personnel about the unusual restrictions on the defendant's background investigation. You ignored requests from the defendant's counsel for security, clarifications that should have prompted immediate consultation with intelligence authorities. Each finding hit Reid like a physical blow. He had been so confident in his ability to read people and situations that he had dismissed every indication that Torres was not what she appeared to be. His arrogance had blinded him to obvious signs that should have prompted any competent prosecutor to seek additional clarification before proceeding with such serious charges. Deputy Director Stevens rose and approached the podium with documents that Reid knew would detail the operational consequences of his mistake. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Reid could see the controlled anger in her eyes as she prepared to brief Admiral Mitchell on the damage assessment that had been completed over the past 3 weeks. Admiral Mitchell, Stevens began, with the kind of measured precision that characterized all her communications. The compromise of Lieutenant Commander Torres' operational cover has resulted in the termination of 17 ongoing intelligence operations across 4 different theaters. We have been forced to evacuate 12 foreign assets whose lives were endangered by the exposure of their connection to American intelligence services. Reid listened in horror as Stevens detailed the human cost of his prosecutorial error. 3 of the evacuated assets had been discovered by hostile intelligence services during their extraction and were now presumed dead. 2 major intelligence networks that had taken years to develop had been completely dismantled to protect remaining sources. Ongoing operations that could have prevented terrorist attacks and provided critical intelligence about enemy capabilities had been terminated. The financial cost of rebuilding these intelligence networks and establishing Lieutenant Commander Torres in a new operational capacity is estimated at $47 million, Stevens continued. The strategic cost in terms of lost intelligence, capabilities, and compromised operations cannot be quantified, but represents a significant setback to American intelligence gathering in several critical regions. Admiral Mitchell made notes as Stevens spoke, his expression growing more serious with each revelation about the scope of Reid's mistake. This wasn't just about one prosecutor's career ending in disgrace. It was about national security consequences that would reverberate for years to come. Stevens opened another folder and began displaying photographs that showed the real-world consequences of compromised intelligence operations, abandoned safe houses in hostile territories, foreign assets who had been executed by their own governments after their cooperation with American intelligence was discovered, military operations that had failed because critical intelligence was no longer available. Lieutenant Commander Torres had been developing intelligence assets in the Iranian nuclear program for 3 years, Stevens explained as she showed Admiral Mitchell classified photographs and documents. Her blown cover has forced us to abandon contact with sources who were providing critical information about weapons development programs that pose a direct threat to American interests and regional allies. Reid realized that his mistake had consequences that extended far beyond his own career, or even Torres' operational security. American service members might die in future conflicts because intelligence that could have warned them of enemy capabilities was no longer available. Terrorist attacks might succeed because intelligence networks that could have provided warning had been compromised. Admiral Mitchell closed the investigation report and fixed Reid with a stare that contained no sympathy or understanding. Captain Reid, your prosecution of Lieutenant Commander Torres represents one of the most serious security breaches in recent military history. Your failure to follow established protocols and your disregard for obvious warning signs has compromised ongoing operations and endangered American lives. Reid wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had been working with incomplete information and following what he believed were appropriate procedures. But the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming, and he realized that any attempt to justify his actions would only make him appear more foolish and irresponsible. The investigation has determined that your actions, while not criminal in nature, demonstrate a fundamental lack of judgment and professional competence that makes you unsuitable for continued service in the Judge Advocate General Corps. Admiral Mitchell continued, your security clearance is permanently revoked, and you are hereby relieved of all duties pending administrative separation from the Navy. Reid felt the finality of those words settling over him like a shroud. 20 years of military service, a career he had built through careful planning and relentless ambition, was ending in disgrace and professional ruin. He would be remembered not as a successful prosecutor who had protected military justice, but as the officer whose arrogance and incompetence had compromised national security. Deputy Director Stevens approached Reid's table and placed a document in front of him that he recognized as a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Captain Reid, you have been exposed to classified information about ongoing intelligence operations that is vital to American national security. You will sign this agreement acknowledging your understanding that any disclosure of this information would constitute treason and result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act. Reid signed the document without reading it, knowing that his signature was binding him to a lifetime of silence about the most significant case of his career. He would never be able to tell anyone the real story of why his prosecution of Elena Torres had failed so spectacularly. The truth about her identity and his mistake would remain classified at levels that ensured it would never become public knowledge. As Admiral Mitchell prepared to close the proceedings, the courtroom door opened and Elena Torres entered wearing civilian clothes and carrying herself with the quiet confidence that Reid now recognized as characteristic of her true identity. She had requested permission to address the administrative review, Though Reid couldn't imagine what she might want to say to the man who had tried to destroy her career and compromised her life's work. Torres approached the podium and faced Admiral Mitchell with the same composed bearing she had displayed throughout her court-martial. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had briefed senior government officials and managed complex international operations. Admiral Mitchell, I requested permission to address this review because I believe Captain Reid's case raises important questions about how the military justice system handles cases involving classified operations. Torres began, while Captain Reid made serious errors in judgment. The security failure was systemic rather than individual. Reid looked up in surprise, uncertain why Torres would speak on his behalf after everything he had done to her. Admiral Mitchell gestured for her to continue, clearly interested in her perspective on the broader implications of the case. The investigation has focused appropriately on Captain Reid's procedural failures, but it has not adequately addressed the institutional weaknesses that allowed this situation to develop, Torres continued. The protocols designed to protect deep cover operatives from exposure through the military justice system failed at multiple levels. Captain Reid was given access to fabricated personnel files without being informed that they were part of an operational cover story. Torres turned slightly to look at Reid, her expression containing no anger or resentment, just the kind of professional assessment that he had learned to recognize during their brief interactions. Captain Reid is guilty of arrogance and poor judgment, but he is also a victim of security protocols that were inadequate to protect the classified nature of my operational assignment. Reid felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion as Torres continued her measured defense of his actions. She wasn't excusing his mistakes or minimizing their consequences, but she was providing context that the investigation had largely ignored in its focus on his individual failures. The damage assessment has been significant, but it has also provided valuable lessons about how to better protect deep cover operatives from inadvertent exposure through routine military administrative processes, Torres explained. Captain Reid's case has prompted a comprehensive review of security protocols that will prevent similar incidents in the future. Admiral Mitchell made notes as Torres spoke, clearly considering her perspective on the broader institutional failures that had contributed to the security breach. Reid realized that Torres was using her final statement to accomplish something that went beyond defending him. She was ensuring that future intelligence operatives would be better protected from the kind of systemic failure that had compromised her own mission. Lieutenant Commander Torres, Admiral Mitchell said when she had finished her statement, your perspective on the institutional aspects of this case is noted and will be forwarded to appropriate authorities for consideration. In the ongoing security protocol review, Torres nodded and returned to her seat, having accomplished what Reid now understood was a final operational objective, using even this difficult situation to advance American intelligence capabilities by improving the security protocols that protected deep cover operatives. Admiral Mitchell closed his notes and prepared to deliver his final judgment on Reid's case. Captain Reid, while Lieutenant Commander Torres has provided important context about the institutional failures that contributed to this incident, your individual responsibility for the consequences cannot be diminished. Your career in the Navy is terminated, and you will carry the knowledge of this failure for the rest of your life. Reid stood and accepted the judgment with what remained of his military bearing. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and his future uncertain. But as he looked at Elena Torres sitting quietly in the gallery, he felt something that surprised him, respect for someone who had turned even her own professional destruction into an opportunity to serve her country's interests. The proceedings concluded with the administrative efficiency that characterized all military justice, but Reid knew that the real consequences were just beginning. He would face months of debriefing sessions with intelligence officials who needed to understand exactly what he had learned about Torres' operations. His job prospects in the civilian world would be limited by his inability to explain why his military career had ended so abruptly. His security clearance revocation would eliminate most of the government positions that might have been available. To a former JAG officer. As Reid prepared to leave the courtroom for the final time, Torres approached him with the same professional courtesy she had displayed throughout their interactions. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear what she was saying. "Captain Reid, you made serious mistakes that had significant consequences, but you also had the intellectual honesty to recognize your errors when they were revealed," she said with measured calm. "That kind of honesty is rarer than you might think, and it suggests that you learned something important from this experience." Reid wanted to apologize again, to express his admiration for her professionalism and dedication, but he realized that any words he might offer would be inadequate to address the scope of his mistake and its consequences. Torres seemed to understand his struggle to find appropriate words. The most important lesson from this case isn't about intelligence protocols or security procedures. It's about the difference between serving your own interests and serving something larger than yourself. You have an opportunity to carry that lesson forward into whatever you do next. As Torres walked away, Reid understood that he had been given a final gift from someone whose life he had tried to destroy. She had shown him what true service looked like, and she had suggested that even his catastrophic failure could become an opportunity for growth and understanding if he chose to learn from it, rather than simply being defeated by it. Reid left Norfolk Naval Station for the final time, carrying with him the knowledge that he had encountered someone whose dedication to service surpassed anything he had ever imagined possible. Elena Torres had sacrificed her career, her operational identity, and years of careful work without complaint or bitterness, focused only on ensuring that future operatives would be better protected from the kind of systemic failure that had compromised her mission. The real resolution of the Torres case wasn't about justice or punishment. It was about the difference between those who serve themselves and those who serve something greater. Reid's career had ended in disgrace, but his education in what true service meant was just beginning. The woman who had every reason to hate him had instead taught him the most important lesson of his life, that real honor comes not from personal achievement, but from sacrificing personal interests for the greater good of something larger than yourself. 6 months after leaving Norfolk Naval Station in disgrace, Marcus Reid found himself working as a paralegal in a small law firm in Richmond, Virginia. The transition from respected military prosecutor to civilian support staff had been humbling, but Reid discovered something unexpected in his new role: genuine satisfaction in helping people navigate legal challenges without the ego and ambition that had driven his military career. His mornings began with reviewing case files for attorneys who treated him with professional courtesy despite knowing nothing about his background. Reid had learned to appreciate the simple dignity of honest work performed without ulterior motives. The non-disclosure agreement he had signed prevented him from ever explaining why his military career had ended, but he found that the silence suited him better than the constant need for recognition that had previously defined his professional identity. Elena Torres had vanished completely from public view after the security review concluded. Reid occasionally wondered what new identity she had assumed, what dangerous missions she might be conducting, what sacrifices she was making that would never be acknowledged or rewarded. He had learned enough about the intelligence community to understand that her work would continue in shadows and silence, protecting people who would never know her name or understand the risks she accepted on their behalf. The law firm where Reid worked specialized in helping veterans navigate disability claims and family legal issues. His clients were often struggling with problems that seemed insignificant compared to the national security matters he had once handled, but Reid discovered that helping a disabled veteran secure proper benefits or assisting a military family with custody issues provided a satisfaction that his high-profile prosecutions had never delivered. One Thursday afternoon, Reid was reviewing medical records for a veteran's disability claim when his supervisor, Janet Martinez, approached his desk with an unusual request. A new client had specifically asked for Reid's assistance with a legal matter, despite never having worked with the firm before. The client had declined to explain how she knew about Reid's background, or why she preferred to work with him rather than one of the firm's attorneys. Reid looked up from his work to see Elena Torres sitting in the firm's waiting area, dressed in casual civilian clothes and carrying a simple briefcase. She looked different somehow, more relaxed than he remembered, as if the constant pressure of maintaining a false identity had finally been lifted. When their eyes met, she smiled with genuine warmth rather than the professional courtesy that had characterized their previous interactions. Martinez led Torres to a small conference room where Reid joined them for what Torres explained was a consultation about establishing a nonprofit organization focused on supporting veterans with service-connected mental health issues. She had funding from anonymous donors and needed legal assistance, navigating the regulatory requirements for tax-exempt status. After Martinez left them alone to discuss the details, Torres leaned back in her chair and studied Reid with the same assessing gaze he remembered from their confrontations at Norfolk. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the operational authority that had characterized her revelations about her intelligence career. "I wasn't sure you'd be willing to see me," Torres said quietly. "I know our last encounter wasn't exactly pleasant for either of us." Reid felt the familiar weight of shame and regret that he had carried since learning the truth about her identity. "Lieutenant Commander Torres, I owe you apologies that I can never adequately express. My arrogance and incompetence compromised your mission and endangered people whose lives depended on your work." Torres held up a hand to stop his self-recrimination. "Marcus, I came here because I wanted to tell you something that I couldn't say during the official proceedings. Your prosecution of me, while based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions, demonstrated exactly the kind of dedication to justice that the military needs from its legal professionals." Reid looked at her in confusion, unable to understand how she could view his catastrophic mistake as anything other than a complete failure of professional judgment. Torres seemed to recognize his bewilderment and continued her explanation with patient clarity. "You believed you were prosecuting someone who had betrayed her oath and endangered American lives. You pursued that prosecution with thoroughness, determination, and absolute commitment to what you believed was justice. Those qualities are exactly what military prosecutors should bring to their work when they're actually dealing with genuine criminals." Torres opened her briefcase and removed a folder that contained newspaper clippings and official reports about other military justice cases. Reid recognized several high-profile prosecutions where JAG officers had failed to pursue obvious evidence of wrongdoing or had allowed political considerations to influence their legal decisions. "The problem with your case wasn't your dedication to justice, Marcus. The problem was that the system failed to protect both of us from a situation that should never have developed. You were given false information and asked to make prosecutorial decisions without access to the facts you needed to understand what was really happening." Reid studied the documents Torres had brought, recognizing cases where military prosecutors had been criticized for failing to show exactly the kind of aggressive pursuit of justice that had characterized his handling of her prosecution. The irony was devastating. His greatest professional failure had actually demonstrated the prosecutorial virtues that were missing from cases involving actual criminal behavior. Torres continued her explanation with the same methodical precision that Reid remembered from her courtroom revelations. "I spent 3 years working with military justice professionals around the world as part of my intelligence assignments. I've seen prosecutors who were afraid to challenge senior officers, afraid to pursue unpopular cases, afraid to risk their careers for the sake of justice. You weren't afraid of any of those things." Reid felt a strange mixture of vindication and continued regret as Torres reframed his understanding of their confrontation. He had been wrong about the facts, catastrophically wrong, but his approach to the prosecution had reflected exactly the kind of professional integrity that military justice required. The nonprofit I'm establishing will work with veterans who are struggling with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and other invisible wounds from their service, Torres explained as she returned to the ostensible reason for her visit. I want you to serve on the board of directors and help us navigate the legal and administrative challenges of supporting people who have sacrificed more than most civilians can understand. Reid realized that Torres was offering him something far more valuable than legal work or professional rehabilitation. She was providing him with an opportunity to channel the prosecutorial skills and dedication to justice that had defined his military career into work that would directly benefit the veterans whose interests he had always claimed to serve. Elena, I would be honored to help with your organization in any way I can. But I need you to understand that my mistakes in your case will always be part of my professional record. My involvement might create problems for your nonprofit that you don't need. Torres smiled with the kind of genuine amusement that Reid had never seen during their official interactions. Marcus, the people who will be funding and supporting this organization understand exactly what happened during your prosecution of me. They also understand that your willingness to admit your mistakes and learn from them demonstrates exactly the kind of character they want associated with their investment in veteran services. Reid spent the remainder of the afternoon working with Torres to outline the legal framework for her nonprofit organization. As they discussed governance structures, regulatory compliance, and operational procedures, Reid recognized that she was creating something that would provide direct, practical assistance to veterans who were struggling with challenges that government programs often failed to address adequately. When their work session concluded, Torres gathered her materials and prepared to leave with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized all her actions. At the conference room door, she paused and turned back to face Reid one final time. Marcus, the most important lesson from our case isn't about intelligence protocols or prosecutorial procedures. It's about the difference between failing because you're afraid to try and failing because you're willing to risk everything for what you believe is right. You failed for the right reasons, and that's something you should carry with you rather than something you should regret. As Torres left the law firm, Reid understood that she had given him something that his military career had never provided: the knowledge that his dedication to justice, even when misdirected, had been recognized and valued by someone whose opinion mattered more than any fitness report or efficiency evaluation. 6 months later, the Elena Torres Foundation for Veteran Mental Health was operating support programs in 12 states, providing counseling services, legal assistance, and advocacy for veterans whose service-connected injuries were often invisible to civilian society. Reid served as the organization's legal counsel, working directly with veterans who had sacrificed pieces of themselves in service to their country. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, but Reid found a satisfaction in it that his military prosecutions had never provided. Every veteran he helped navigate a disability claim, every family he assisted with legal challenges, every successful advocacy effort represented a direct contribution to the welfare of people who had served something larger than themselves. Torres visited the Foundation's Richmond office quarterly, reviewing programs and meeting with veterans who had been helped by the organization she had created. During these visits, she and Reid worked together with the same professional cooperation that might have characterized their relationship if they had met under different circumstances. Reid never learned what new identity Torres had assumed for her continued intelligence work, never discovered what missions she was conducting or what sacrifices she was making in service to American interests. But he understood that the Foundation represented her way of serving veterans who had given everything for their country, just as she continued to give everything for hers. The final resolution of their confrontation wasn't about justice or punishment or professional rehabilitation. It was about two people who had learned to channel their dedication to service into work that directly benefited the veterans, whose sacrifices made their own careers possible. Reid had lost his military career, but he had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that true service meant helping others rather than advancing yourself. Years later, when Reid looked back on his prosecution of Elena Torres, he no longer saw it as the greatest failure of his career. Instead, he saw it as the moment when he finally learned what it meant to serve something larger than his own ambitions. The woman who had every reason to destroy him had instead taught him the most important lesson of his life: that honor comes not from never failing, but from how you choose to rebuild after failure has shown you who you really are. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.